Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1492 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday evening into Tuesday. And today's podcast is brought to you by the good folks at FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn right now to get started. Also, make us your first listen each and every day on this podcast at Locked On Hawks. Find us anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, etc. And this is actually going to be a part 2. So if you missed part 1, I would definitely encourage you to listen to that. It should be available in your feed right now. But this is part 2 with myself and Glenn talking about John Collins and his role for this year, his role for last year, his performance, the big picture, the details, the nuance, all of that wrapped up in one place. And our player capsule series is ongoing. We've already talked about the majority of the Hawks roster: Capella, Hunter, Okongwu, AJ Griffin, Jalen Johnson, Bogdanovich, Sadiq Bey. All those guys have already been covered on the podcast, and there should be available for you in the archive. We'll have a couple more later on, but today, John Collins, this is part 2 to listen to right now. Without any further delay, here's the intro. I'll be back with myself and Glenn talking more about John Collins.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
In an effort to not go 2 hours on John Collins, because we probably could, let's talk about the offense. And it's interesting because a lot of what we said about the defense applies in a different way. And I have to lead with this. I think people will probably I'm sure we'll get accused of being too nice about this. That's fine. Every single number I pulled for John Collins over the last couple of years in offense is basically directly linked to a change in usage and a change in role, much more than a change in individual capability, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I could give you all of them. I won't do them all, but like here's one, for example. He had a career low this year in pick and roll dive man usage, which is, I think everyone agreed, used to be and probably still is his best skill in offense. And he's doing it less than ever, which is not because of him. It's because he's playing next to a center. There's that. He's spotted up more this year than ever before. He had a 30.4% spot up percentage this year. The last year before Clint got here was 16%. So his spot ups have doubled since Clint arrived. Same thing when it comes to career low usage overall in offense, 17%. That's below the league average in offensive usage. Career low offensive rebound rate, again tied to role. When you're at 3-point line, you don't rebound on the glass as much as you would if you were playing closer to the rim. One more, a career low in rim attempt percentage. And it's like how many shots do you take at the rim compared to your overall shot profile. Career high in 3-point attempt rate. I can go on and on and on. And all that is to tell you in one package that they have asked John or told John, and he, to your point earlier, has cooperated and done what he's been asked to do, to be a spot up, low usage role player on offense. Which, again, one of those things where if you told me 3 years ago, that John Collins is going to be a 3-point, not specialist, but like that was his main role as a spot shooter this year, that sounds insane to 2018 Brad. It breaks my brain. But they just did it for a year, even more so. And it was already happening before that, granted. But even more so this year than ever. And part of that's having Dejounte and having another guy who wasn't just a floor spacer, all that kind of we talked about a lot. But as we get into kind of the numbers here and what he did this year, what he didn't do, I feel like you have to lead with the fact that he's being asked to play a role on offense that is not his best role. And by the way, that's not my opinion. That's not your opinion. That's something that they have all acknowledged, from him to the coaching staff, whether it be Quinn or Nate. They all know. Everybody knows. The front office knows. They all know that he's not being used in the best possible way for him. On this team, I get why they use him this way in a lot of ways. Now, is there nuance to that? Sure, there is. I'd argue for some certain things, but when you have Clint and when you have even Onyeka, you have to play a certain way with your power forward, with the other guys around him. So that's a long soliloquy, but I feel like you have to lead with that because, yes, he didn't shoot the ball well this year, and it pretty much tanked his overall value when it comes to offense. Like, I'll be the first to acknowledge that. I'll let you talk about it too. If you just look at what he actually did numbers-wise this year, it wasn't particularly impressive because he didn't shoot threes well. Now, there's a debate on whether that's a fluke or not. I'll give you the numbers later on. Like, he shot very well on threes for 3 or 4 years before that. And I've said multiple times on this podcast, I don't believe he's now a 28% 3-point shooter. I don't believe that. But he did this year. So if you're talking about this year only, certainly there are value and production concerns because, as he has acknowledged, and he didn't shoot the ball well, and that really hurt him. First to say that. But there is context. That's what we're doing on this capsule series, is like talking about, yes, what happened, but also why it happened and what it says about the future. Because to your what we said before, it's not just Collins sucks or Collins doesn't suck. It's just not what it is. But he didn't shoot the ball well this year. I'll say that. That's certainly the case. And because of what I just said about the role, that was magnified.
Yeah, I mean, the shooting, the first 80% of the season or wherever we draw that line.
Yeah,
because in March and April he shot 38%. If you add the Boston series, his last 106 attempts, 37%. That's more representative of his career, right?
That's a 4-year average of. I have it now actually, just to say it. The 3 years before this year, it was 38.8% combined. Yeah. The 4 years
did in March and April, even if you include the Boston series, right?
Right, and the 4 years, if you want to go even back to where, like, honestly, before he really became a prolific shooter, I'm going to include one of those early seasons when he first started shooting threes. If you include that, it's 4 seasons, 37.9% from three. Now, I'm not saying he's Kyle Korver. He's not. He's never been. He's not going to be that. He shoots open shots. That's all that is. But like, if you're looking at his career, even before he was a shooter at all, this season was the outlier. And maybe this is real. I don't know. But to what you just said, he really essentially had a 4-month shooting slump in the middle of a 5-year sample size.
Yeah, but I will say that I think when you see that happen with a lower volume shooter, I think you worry more.
Agreed.
Than with a higher volume shooter. You're like, oh man, it feels like this could stick. And like
confidence and the finger injury and the confidence, all that. Yes, right. I totally agree. It is more plausible that John could struggle as a 3-point shooter than it is for someone who has been known for that and who got to the league on that. Like, this is a developed skill for John. He was not supposed to be this kind of shooter, but he did it for a long episode. But you're right. There is a little bit more concern that if it was like if Sadiq Bey just like had 3 bad months shooting, I would chalk it up to nothing. Whereas with John, it's more concerning. I still trust the sample more than this, but it's a little bit more eyebrow raising for sure.
Yeah. The lower volume just means you haven't built up the same confidence. If he's someone who shot 500 threes a year or whatever, it's just kind of it's just a totally different thing, right? And so I just want to acknowledge like fans who will be like, I don't know, like there's a part like I trust him to shoot better than he did this past year. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I want to say, oh, he's going to go right back to being a reliable 38% shooter the rest of that's a question. That's a fair question.
I totally agree. I think he's better than this year. I will stand on that. I'm very confident that he's not this bad of a shooter. Yeah. But you're right. I don't know if I would if you said, okay, Brad, what is John Collins going to shoot? Let's just say similar shot diet to this year. What would he shoot next year? I don't think I'm going to say 38. I'd probably go like 35, 36. And that's still a lot better than it was this year, but it's not 38. Today's show is brought to you by the good folks at eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure the right players are the perfect fits for your roster. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part has to fit just right. The next time you're looking for parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. eBay's guaranteed fit. You can be sure every single part that you need happens to fit right and does so the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage. Look for the green check to know the part will be fitting for you or your money will be coming back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop with eBay Motors. With almost 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game with no time wasted. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are actually guaranteed for you. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. One more time, that is ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Hopefully, for him and for the team and everything, hopefully he kind of gets back up there. But I think there's a question. And the other thing to kind of throw out about his shooting, I know we'll talk about his offensive limitations and how they show up in a team that's built around Trey as well.
Yeah,
especially with him playing at the 4. But I think a lot of fans don't realize like he's a really good shooter. If we're just using kind of the general term shooter, right? He is a really good shooter. His ability to kind of create his own shot against a single defender. I'm going to be specific about that. Against a single defender
one-on-one
in the mid post, that inside pivot on the right hand side, his ability to kind of get to a step back, his ability to kind of get into the middle of the paint, shoot from 12, 13 feet. He's pretty unique in his ability to not. I mean, he's a pure shooter, pull up, 1 dribble, 2 dribble, pull up for a guy who plays at the 4.
He's got great touch. I mean, it's always been that way. I have the numbers too, like just to back you up. He shot almost 80% at the rim this year. He's always been just uber elite at finishing around the rim. And then you go a step out, 50% on long twos. Like that's an outlier good number. 46% on floater range shots is above average. 80% at the line is really, really good for a powerful, like everything except 3-point shooting this year.
Right.
But you're right, 100%.
So, but in the general sense, like I don't want to say he's a great, even for the position, I don't want to say he's a great shooter. He's not a Gallinari or whoever else we want to pick, right? But he's a really good shooter, right? He has really good touch, his form, his technique, his ability to get to his shot. Now, we want to talk about this. How big of a skill set does he have to get to that? I think he has kind of 3 or 4 primary ways he wants to get to that pull-up shot, right?
Yeah.
And so that's not something you can build your offense around as a primary thing you want to go to a lot. To me, it's matchup based. There's a defense on the other side of the of the game that's cross matching, putting bigger guys on Trey, and so it's a tool to have that you can put to use situationally. In my mind, now I know John would be like, "No, I should be able to do that all the time." That's just how NBA players are, right?
Of course.
And he said that like it feels like once a year in some sort of podcast or interview or whatever, where he's like, "I want to do more." Now he puts it into context like, "I feel like I can help my team more," and that I don't think that that's something he's fabricating as a message, because when you watch him play as a good teammate and a guy who works hard all the time, that to me that backs up. But in his mind, he can do a lot more. I'll never forget. I think it was maybe 3 seasons ago. He was on with Woj, and Woj asked him like, "What player do you kind of imagine?" He threw out the name Giannis, and never going to happen. Right. Never going to happen.
Of course.
Right? But you don't. I mean, you understand an NBA player like thinking like, I can do a lot more to help my team, right? But in my mind, it's like, when I watch him play in the mid-range, even one-on-one with a good matchup, it's still about 3, maybe 4 ways he gets to his shot. Mm-hmm. And when you're playing against a really good defender, that's not enough to be a primary source of your offense. Throw it into the mix. When they run a second defender at him, that's where his ball handling limitation kind of limits him. That's where I don't know if I even want to say processing, but I think it's more of the skill. Like, I think he'll read the play, but then the skill you need as a ball handler / passer to kind of punish a double team or whatever, or a stunt or whatever it is just not there. And that's where the limitation really shows up. And for me, it kind of goes back to some things we talked about Hunter. When you have below average ball handling and below average passing at the 3 and the 4, and the other team is forcing the ball out of Trey's hands, that's a problem. And so if he were at the 5, rim running, diving to the rim the whole time, that's a lot more viable for them. At the 4, for this to work, it's going to have to be like, okay, if they're trapping, blitzing Trey, forcing the ball to Trey's hands, we're going to try to get a mismatch for John to let him go to work there. You still don't want to do that 8 times a game. That's still probably 3, 4, maybe 5 times a game you're going to do that. And you're going to do that, try to force them out of being so aggressive on Trey. We do this once or twice. See John kind of beat an average or less than average defender. It's going to help Trey, and that's what it's built around. But when it comes to his ball handling and passing, there's just not enough there for what you need, given the way that most defenses try to attack Trey.
I totally agree. And there's so much context that's involved, and we try to isolate the player, also put them into context on these discussions. And I'm glad you put it that way with regard to it's really the whole front court. Hunter and Collins as a pairing is one thing. Then you throw in Clint, like with Onyeka, maybe it's a more interesting discussion down the line. We talked about him a lot on that episode. But when you start, and this has been the established starting front court for 2+ seasons now, of Hunter, Collins, and Capella, you don't have the combination of playmaking. I agree. It's not necessarily processing with Collins, but ball handling. They don't have those outlets with those 3 guys, and I agree with Hunter and Collins. And that's the thing. Like, individually, these guys all have notable. We talked about Hunter a lot, but especially with the bigs. But I think we can be at the point now where I don't think the Hawks are going to be able to do what they want to do as a franchise with that trio. And that's not like a hot take. It's a pretty obvious statement to make. I mean, their offense can be in the regular season incredible. We've seen it. And they could reach high heights in the playoffs with that group. It's happened. But as far as like, you're putting so much pressure on Trey already. And that was maybe why they went and got Dejounte, was to like, okay, now we have two of these guys to kind of make up for the fact that our starting front court doesn't really do that for us. And I get it. But in the crucible of the playoffs or against a good defense, like, teams are going to make them try to beat you with Hunter and Collins doing things that they don't want to do. And that's not a great position to be in. I think for the longest time, we've all talked about, even when they made the trade for Clint, because it was during the pandemic, we spent months literally talking about how it was going to work. I'm sure you remember this. Just Collins and Capella before you even got to Hunter, because that was when we didn't know as much about Hunter as we do now.
Right.
And yeah, we all agreed then. We agree now. No one would draw up a Collins Capella offensive pairing in the modern NBA. It's not what you would choose. Doesn't mean. And by the way, it still worked fairly well.
Yep. But
that's not what you would choose. And then you throw in Hunter as well, and it gets even worse. So, I've made the statement before that if I'm John Collins' agent, let's say, this is the worst possible context for my client on offense. Within reason, you know what I mean? Like, we've seen John put up 2010, 18-9 seasons in better contexts. And I think if you put John on another team, pick whichever team that is, Oklahoma City is one that's a favorite right now because of Chet, or Indiana with Miles Turner and Halliburton. Pick your good context. I think he'd have a lot better numbers, counting stat numbers that you and I value less than other people do. But you know what I mean? And part of that is just the situation. But going back to what he can and can't do, yeah, he is limited as a playmaker, passer, ball handler in the modern NBA as a 4. And that is magnified when your 5 can't do that and your 3 doesn't really do that as well. Like, it all kind of builds on each other to where it's hard to isolate these guys individually. But it is worth noting that, like, that is a limitation for John, in which I think he's gotten a little bit better in certain areas, but he's never going to be a high-end ball handler, playmaker for that position. That's not going to happen. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make a fast break to FanDuel right now to bet on all the sporting action that you're looking for. And right now, FanDuel customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 in bonus bets if your first bet does not win at FanDuel. They have great promotions this time of year and really each and every day. You get paid instantly when you win at FanDuel, and the app is safe and secure. They have every kind of betting angle that you're looking for that you might be seeking this time of year as well. They cover the whole range of sports, including the NBA, of course, WNBA, football, baseball, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, et cetera, et cetera. And FanDuel also has different wagering options for you. They have the live betting options. They have single game parlays, futures, player props, point spreads, totals, and money lines. Anything you're looking for, they have it at FanDuel. There's no better place to bet in the basketball space or anywhere in the sporting space than America's #1 sports book, and that is FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on. Get that no-sweat first bet to $2,500. That is FanDuel.com/locked-on. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Now, you mentioned it. We've seen them perform as a top 5 offense with that trio.
It's worked, yeah.
Right? Now, what can make that work is shooting, right? It gives you more space to work with. And then, we talked about they went from 2nd in spot-up efficiency to 29th in spot-up efficiency from 2 years ago to this last season, right? And that impacted John as well. The other thing I want to mention, and I feel like I should tee this up for you because you've been on this for a while. The other thing that really impacted John this year was Dejounte's arrival. Right?
I almost said it just now when you said the thing about spot-ups, because they changed the way they built their team.
Yeah.
And I get why, but sorry, I cut you off. But that was an under-discussed change. And not
it was an issue.
Dejounte.
It was an issue all year long. I was thinking back to like the season before, right? When Trey wasn't on, they had Lou running pick and roll, right?
Yep.
And in other cases too, I know people would be like, "Oh, Glenn, stop talking about him." But in terms of running a pick and roll to create for a big, that was probably Brandon Goodwin's best offensive skill, right? So even when it had to be him for the 10 games or whatever it was that season, right? Tiny volume. Brandon Goodwin's terrible creating his own shot for himself in the pick and roll, but he can create for a big in the pick and roll.
Yeah.
Dejounte is really good at creating for himself in the pick and roll, getting middle, getting to that pull up 8, 10, 12 feet, whatever it is. That's a different discussion that we'll have when we talk about him in terms of how much of that you really want to bake into your primary offensive plan.
Right.
But Dejounte is not better than average at creating for a big via the pick and roll, right? And that's just something that when John was playing on the second unit with Dejounte, and you could see like whether it was when Nate was there or after Quinn took over, they're trying to feel like what is the right pairing with Dejounte, and like they were kind of feeling for that the whole time. But to me, the number one, if we're going to talk about this in the context of two players, the number one fit concern I have on this roster is Dejounte and John playing together, right?
Yeah.
And from a regular season standpoint, maybe not in the playoffs, you get more other problematic areas. But like, how do you feature those two guys together if that's the plan? And I've talked about the fact that one option for this next season is if you move Clint to play John 30 to 40% of his minutes at 5, and to kind of have lineups to kind of flex towards smaller. And for me, it's like, how do you make that work for John, right? If those minutes are going to end up being with Dejounte, that's concerning. Now, maybe Quinn has a solution for that. I don't know. There's nothing obvious to me. But Dejounte's arrival and Nate pushing them more towards getting mismatches for the guards, attacking the mismatches with pull-ups in the mid-range. Like, what in the heck does John do?
Well, that's
Trey Dejounte or attacking a 4 or 5 in the mid-range.
Like, the answer, and the only answer to that question is stand in the corner. And the problem with that, and look, I said it before, I want to acknowledge it again. Some of this would have been better if John had made shots. So he's not blameless. That is part of it. Now, so again, he didn't make shots, but you're right. And it's not a criticism of Dejounte. It's the fact that they changed their offensive approach. And look, it was a reaction to what happened last year, and I understood it. You want to have another guy that can create, and they went and got that guy. But Dejounte isn't a floor spacer that the guys that they had before were. And it's not just Kevin Huerter either. It's the loss of Gallo. It's Bogey being out for the first third of the season. All those things. They didn't have enough shooting, and I tried to yell this all summer long. I think I was right about this. They didn't have enough shooting. That was very evident. Now, it was magnified because of the coach at that point in time. Nate was the worst fit for that as well in some respects. But you're right. I mean, the theory of the case doesn't make sense. When you have Dejounte in particular, or even Trey at times, working into that mid-range area, Trey is one of the best passers in the world, so he can make it work a little bit easier than Dejounte can. But if that's your approach, and you have Clint on the floor, or Onyeka in his current form on the floor, and John, you have to put Collins in the corner, or you have to put Collins deep on the wing. And if he doesn't make shots, that pairing that entire formula does not work. So, and the numbers were not good either. I mean, we'll talk about when we get to Dejounte, but Dejounte on, Trey off was a disaster all year long, basically. And just the theory of the case offensively, when they weren't, on the nights when Dejounte shoots 11 of 17 and makes all his mid-rangers, it works. On the nights he doesn't, we saw it's a little bit more volatile. Then, it was an unfair ask to have Trey literally create everything, which was the plan 2 years ago, and it worked at a high level, but it was just so much of Trey surrounded by shooting. But that is an easier plug-and-play fit than what they had this year. The hope would be, you mentioned Quinn, the hope would be if you're a Hawks fan, barring a changeup, and I think they're probably going to make some changes, but even if they didn't, the hope would be that Quinn has some ideas that Nate didn't have on how to maximize these guys. But I personally think that's not you can't just rely on that being the entire explanation. Maybe Quinn has got something. I do trust him more with this group than I did Nate on offense. But I think the fundamental theory of what you just laid out, which is Trey, Dejounte, whether it's Hunter or someone else in the wing, Collins, and a center, it relies on John shooting a lot of threes and making more than he made this year. Maybe he will. That would have helped. But I don't love that just formula in general.
Yep, agreed. Especially in the playoff context, right?
Oh, definitely. Even worse there. Yeah, I mean,
right.
And he didn't make shots in the playoffs either until, he was okay in the playoffs, but you said it earlier, where they were good with John on the court in the playoffs was defensively. Like they were better overall. I think they were like 5 or 6 points better per 100 with John on the court overall in the playoffs than off. But it was drastically defense. They were great defensively with John, and they were bad on offense with John. It was the exact opposite the way when he was off the floor. But, you know, and again, it's a 6-game sample size. Who cares on some level? But it goes back to the theory.
Yeah. But I mean, it like jumped out at you. Like,
it's obvious. Yeah.
The defense suffered a lot when he wasn't on.
And the offense, so did the offense. I mean, when they played the Stars on offense, they couldn't score. And that.
Right. Yep. Very true. Very true. I think the last thing I'll hit that I think listeners will be disappointed when I hit on it is the contract, like 25, 26 million the rest of the way, right? The last year is a player option, if I remember correctly. And so for me, it's like, are fans asking a fair question? Like, can he deliver to the value of the contract? And my answer there is like, he absolutely has to be in the right role. He absolutely has to be featured in a way that he's never been featured offensively on the Hawks, right? And so I think barring like a pretty big change to kind of roster construction, it's going to be almost impossible for him to deliver the kind of value that's there. Now we could talk about, again, what coaches value, team defense, effort, always up. He's a leader. He's absolutely one of the foremost leaders on this team. And how much does all that work when it comes to like, are you putting him into a position to produce? Is that the right thing to do? Is to give him the offensive volume? He's not good enough to get the offensive volume he thinks he should get. And he's not alone in that in the league, right? Sure. He's not good enough to kind of steer a lot of primary action his way. Those realities, I think, are going to make it very hard, minus a pretty big set of roster changes, for him to deliver to the value of the contract that he has. That's not John's fault. He didn't offer himself that contract. But fans are for sure going to evaluate him against what he's getting paid.
Oh, they already have. I mean, as soon as it happened, I'm sure you've seen this. A lot of negative tweets associated with John have the number attached to it. It's $145 million. This guy makes $100 million. And I hate that framing, but like you said, it's not his fault. But I will do my constitutionally obligated role of pointing out that the cap is rising and people don't quite understand that $25 million is not what it used to be. Now, I agree with you. I'll say this. I agree with you. I think the majority of people that I have talked to around the league who are smarter than I am or around the league view John as a slightly negative contract. It's not an albatross. I've argued this on the podcast before and got yelled at, but I'm say it again very clearly. The Hawks have no albatross contracts. There is no dire disaster John Wall contract on this roster. Could they trade John to every team in the league? No. He's not he's definitely not a universally positive contract. Some view him as a neutral contract, which is kind of where I am. I think it's like okay. It's not terrible money. I totally understand viewing him as a negative contract. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I just people have to at least try. I mean, they probably won't, but it doesn't matter. I have to do my part to attempt. $25 million a year at the end of his contract is about 17-ish% of the salary cap. When he signed that deal, 17% of the cap would have been like $18 million, $20 million. So he's making less than you think he is the point that I will make. Same with Hunter. But I agree. I mean, there's a reason he hasn't been traded. And yes, I do believe the reporting that Tony nixed at least one Collins trade that they probably should have made in retrospect. And I think that if they wanted to badly enough, they could trade him. I do believe that. And part of the problem is, and this is not your expertise, Glenn, so I'm trying not to do the whole thing with you, but part of the problem is that they have held out, and you can argue whether it's a good idea or not, they've held out. They tried to get fair value for John in their mind. They wanted their cake and eat it too. They wanted to be able to get a player back for him, all this stuff, because they didn't want to get worse. And that's why they are where they are now. There's this narrative out there that they could, that they've been unable, quote unquote, to trade him. That is not true. They could have traded him multiple times. They were asking for a lot for him. And the pivot point is now, new front office, what is the urgency level to trade him? Because if the urgency level is urgent, they will trade him. They can do it. It's just what they want back. Because in the past, they've been, again, rigidly asking. I mean, I'm not making this up. They were literally asking for a starting power forward back for him. Like, that's really hard. If you have one framing for a trade, it's hard to get that back. Yeah. Now with Jalen, with Sadiq, however you want to say that, they might be more flexible in what they're asking for. And if Tony or Landry or Quinn, if they want to move him, they will. And that's kind of the short version of it all. But like, I think people have to understand that, like, yeah, it's a lot of money. He didn't, they should have negotiated harder. And we said this at the time. I'm very high on John. I noted this the day they signed the contract, that I thought Travis did not do a great job negotiating that contract down. They had John over a barrel. It was restricted free agency. He didn't have options, but that's Travis. And for better or worse, Travis made a lot of those deals that he didn't squeeze really hard. That was not his personality. So that's, ancient history now, but that's where they are. I mean, they have a deal that I think generally is seen as slightly negative value, at least slightly negative value. And living up to it is eye of the beholder on some level, but you're right. I mean, if the role that he's in, to bring it full circle from this last year, he cannot. Maybe it's going to sound like a hot take. If that's the role he's assigned to, he cannot live up to that contract. And that's not his fault either. Like, 100%. Yes, if he shot 38% from three this year, would it have been better? Sure, it would have been. He would have been a lot more valuable to the team on offense if he had shot the ball better. But as far as like what he's making versus the role, it makes it impossible for him to live up to the contract. Yeah. Like he can't average 22 points a game or whatever it's going to be. Like, pick your fan number, 20 points a game. He can't do that on this role. It's impossible.
Yeah. Based upon everything you hear, and you hear more first person than I do, but I hear from you and others that the limitation on trading him to this point has been, up until now, if they trade John, they didn't have a starting power forward. They did not have one.
That was their concern. I mean, the thing, and again, that was, I'm not defending this position. I'm just telling you what the position always was from the previous regime. They were unwilling to, in their mind, take a step back on the court to move him. That was their position. I'm, again, not saying that was the correct position. I'm saying that's what happened. Like, every deal that they talked about with another team always had a starting power forward caliber player coming back to them. And now that might be different. They might believe that Saddiq Bey can do that. They might believe that Jalen Johnson can do that. But put your 6 month ago hat on. They didn't have Saddiq Bey, and Jalen Johnson had proven nothing 6 months ago.
Yeah, and I think the league and the market recognized, like, you guys are in a bad spot with him.
Of course,
you can't feature him the way he needs to be featured. You can't generate the production that
they killed. Listen, the organization, and I think they know this, and they admit it on the record. I mean, obviously on a lie detector test, the organization killed his trade value.
Yeah.
Like, they know that now. They held on to they held on to him too long. It's the role. It's that they overpaid in the deal in some respects. Like, they did this to themselves. But now we're here. So yeah, that's the thing.
That's where we are. Yeah. And I'll close by saying this. John Collins is a good NBA player. He does a lot of things that show up in the wins, right? The help defense, the effort, the working in transition, all the stuff we've kind of gone over. Also, he has a number of offensive limitations that require you to construct lineups that feature him in his best set of skills, right? And that's just the reality. And if the Hawks can't continue to not be able to do that, then that's something that they have to figure out, right? And is a trade the right thing? It absolutely might be the right thing, right? Do they have more flexibility now? They absolutely should have more flexibility now, because Jalen can play, right? Saddiq can handle some minutes at the four. Hunter even has shown, we talked about that, Hunter has shown growth defensively in a way that makes you think he's pretty viable at the four in some lineups, right? So I think the Hawks can go look at trades now and not be like, oh, I have to get back a Harrison Barnes or a Jay Crowder or whoever, right? We can look at a lot of different trade constructs that we couldn't look at even 6 months ago, and that's the situation. Am I dying for John to be traded off his team? Like, I root for people, and I like John's effort and the kind of teammate he is and stuff. So if he's going to be happier like somewhere else and kind of get to realize more of what he wants to be as an NBA player, then great. Like, I hope for that for him. I'll say this: like, the Hawks are trying to get better on defense, and trading John Collins is not an obvious step in the direction of getting better on defense, unless you've got a good 2, 3, 4 step plan that kind of solves for replacing the things that he's been kind of giving them on defense. Again, a fan might be like, "Oh, he's not an all NBA defender, an all defense kind of guy,"
and that's true. He's not.
But there are. I have a chance to ask NBA coach. Connectivity, communication, the effort, the all that stuff. That's stuff that shows up in wins. That stuff shows up especially in close games where you get a win, a couple, one or two possessions down the stretch where a guy makes an impact play. That stuff that matters and is valuable. Does that mean that the other issues that he has in his game aren't material? No, it doesn't mean that at all. And so the Hawks have got to figure out, do we have a plan with a new roster that allows us to set him up to give us more? That's the fundamental question at play here, right? Can we set him up to give us more? Yes or no? A lot flows from that for me. And he's not the kind of guy that's like, I'm just going to throw him out there and he's going to do good stuff no matter. No. He's got to be put in the right spot in the right role. Question is, can we set him up to give us more? That's the fundamental thing they have to answer. I think that factors into what they do about him.
Yeah, I agree. And we talked about it once before. I think it was on the Kongwu show. I do think that there is a path to keep Collins if they want to do that. If the option, this is me talking now, if the option is to trade him at a loss, pay assets to get off of him, I would not do that. I think that there is a path to use him better. I think maybe the cleanest way to do that is to move Clint. I think it's hard to bring both those guys back. I'll acknowledge that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's hard. That's grabbed card before, but yeah, it's nuanced. It's a very nuanced discussion. That's always hard to convey sometimes. And for some people, it's just what do the numbers look like? What's he shoot that day or whatever? And I get it. And he is a limited player. Doesn't mean he's not a good player. It's glad you put it that way. He is a good player. Whether he's worth the contract, whether whatever you want to say, there is, the gap. Basically, I believe the gap in reasonable discussion on John Collins is he a $20 million player or $25 million player? You know what I mean? I don't think that. I think it's totally understandable to say he is overpaid, as long as you acknowledge that he's still a good basketball player, because he's proven to be a good basketball player, a good NBA player for several seasons, and he's 25 years old. So there's no reason to believe he's just over the hill now or something like that. If he was 32, I'd understand, but he's not. So again, I gave the caveat at the beginning. Glenn and I both value John. I think are predisposed to valuing what John does more than others might, and that's fine. We tried to present the negatives too, because they do exist. He's not a perfect player by any means. He had a rough shooting season that hurt them. All that stuff. So we've gone long, as we were probably always going to do on this one. But Glenn, I do appreciate everything. I think you've signed off on your thoughts. But if you have more, please feel free. If not, you can tell people where they can find all of your other stuff.
I think we covered it all. So ATL 29 podcast. Kevin and I over there. I think we're going to try to get one, maybe two episodes around. We're not going to do a holistic kind of draft cover. It's just not who we are. Even the effort I put into it, that's no one should look to me to be an expert on those sorts of things. I think we're going to talk about guys that could be looking to draft at 15, or guys who could be available there. Just give some perspective from a Hawks perspective on that. So that should be coming. Peachtree Hoops, changing of the guard a bit over there. Wes Morton.
Shouts to Wes Morton.
Shouts to Wes for sure. So I'm excited to see what he does with his leadership there, and he has my full support supporting those guys. And on Twitter at Willis_Glenn. Enjoying these finals, and looking forward to the draft is next week.
It's coming. We're getting there. It's coming.
I'm going to be on vacation, out in the woods somewhere. So I've triple checked, quadruple checked that the Wi-Fi is totally solid. Where we're going to be. But I think that should be a fun night too. I think it's always a fun night. It's one of my favorite nights on the NBA calendar. So looking forward to that, and I'll have opinions on Twitter and all that sort of stuff when that comes around too. So,
well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. We have a couple more to do after this. Last year, I know we waited forever to do Trey. It kind of became a meme at some point. I think we recorded that podcast late July. That might happen again. I don't know what's going to happen, but anyway, please check out the entire Player Capsule series. Follow Glenn on Twitter, and ATL on 29 is a great podcast as well. Thanks for subscribing to this podcast, and we'll see everybody next time.